You're listening to Des Plaines, Illinois Community Access Radio, brought to you by the Batman Universe Podcast Network.
Lamont Cranston.
World.
Lamont Cranston.
World. Fighting crime. Harvey Dent. Ba-na-na-na-na-na-na-na.
Lamont Cranston.
Who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows.
Ha 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 ha. Hello, Jimmy.
Who is there?
It is I, the Shadow.
I can't see you.
I am all around you.
Where?
Everywhere around
What?
you. As inevitable as your guilty conscience.
My
to
conscience.
me.
What?
I've been looking forward to this. Our Shadow tribute. If there's one character I like even more than Batman, it's the Shadow. And I think he's just a more, and long-time listeners will know, I do generally love Batman, but the Shadow is just like Batman to the nth power. Like he is just.
It's the impetus for Batman in many ways.
Many ways.
Extremely, would you say without the Shadow as a character, would we even have Batman?
Yeah, not only that, but Michael Uslan will say that, who we will, I've interviewed, and we will have as our supplementary, two-part Shadow tribute. We'll be discussing the history of the Shadow, and how he correlates with Batman in this episode, and then have Michael Uslan do it in a much more eloquent manner next episode.
So Joe is much more versed in the Shadow. I had a passing familiarity with him, but I read some books, and I'm not a complete comic idiot, so, you know.
I mean, this has been kind of like a passion project of mine. I've wanted to do this for a long time. I think it's better that we waited. I think the impetus for us doing it this time was, the crossover between Dynamite and Detective Comics, Shadow and Batman.
Yeah.
So we'll discuss that a little bit.
You've been talking about doing this since episode 1, but we've been on the air now for almost 3 years.
Yeah. I mean, if there was that's kind of like the thing, people always know me as the Batman fan, but they very, very few people know that I like the Shadow. And it's really just, it's easy to get a Batman shirt nowadays. It's easy to pick up a Batman comic book or Batman anything. I can get Batman underwear, but Shadow, it's hard to find,
You're not walking into a Target and seeing, Shadow.
So
t-shirts.
if there was a Batman movie coming out next year and a Shadow movie coming out next year, I'd be more excited about the Shadow movie. Just to put it in perspective. Just if for no reason other than just the rarity of a Shadow movie.
Right. And we're kind of, in a not a glut, but Batman now at this point, it's been diluted almost because there's so much Batman. We haven't had Shadow on the screen in,
it's 94, so yeah.
24 years.
It's crazy.
Yeah. So,
to start off, I think, one of the most interesting questions, the Shadow always says things like, the Shadow knows. He speaks in the third person. He laughs at the most inopportune times. It's kind of like, you ever knew people in that you went to class with in high school, and they'd be talking about horrific, the Holocaust, and then they'd be talking about the most macabre things, and then someone would laugh and what? Why are you, what is there to laugh about? That's how I kind of visualize the Shadow. What is there to laugh about here, dude? You're just gunning down people if people are dying all around you. So, I don't know. What do you think the reason behind it is?
I think, something like that, I think is more of an awkward laugh. I think the Shadow, when he laughs, I think he does it, as a way to intimidate, the people he's going after. It's like a form of torture, almost, psychological, and I think he gets off on it.
Yeah, I think, he relishes just the violence, getting, not innocent victims, but just he likes the violence. And if you, depending on the origin story, like the Shadow is he's the best anti-hero because he was a villain that didn't even try to redeem himself. He was forced to redeem himself. And I think there's still part of him that enjoys that violence, that gets off that bloodthirst.
It was said that he, as a rule, doesn't kill unless he has to, but it almost seems like he
always has
baits them into a situation where, like, he's like, I don't know. I'm like, I'm not touching you. I'm not touching you. Like, hit me. If you hit me, I'm going to kill you. But
there's, there early on, I think it was Cliff Marsland. I may get my agents mistaken here, but, he had an agent that was his sole job was rehabilitating criminals that did pick the right choice. So the Shadow, you're right, does seem to put people in a situation where there's irony, where their persistence to follow a criminal path, results in them dying. But very occasionally, sometimes they do pick the right path and they become an agent of the Shadow.
Yeah. And I think, obviously he knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men. I think to a degree he has a moral code where he can differentiate between those that can be redeemed and those who can't. So
yeah,
it's a very, very deep and interesting comic concept that on the surface, it's a pulp, novel, which was
the precursor,
not the most well-regarded thing.
Yeah.
Same with radio plays
or comic books in the early days. I mean,
Sure.
It wasn't until relatively recently when maybe after the 80s,
late 70s, 80s, graphic novel. Well, my point is though that it is a lot deeper, and there's a lot to be read into in the the stories and the implications of the Shadow.
Yeah. Well, we'll get into the reason why maybe some of you less familiar, and it's through no fault of your own with the character of the Shadow. But just to break down the Shadow's impact on Batman, the first appearance of Batman in Detective Comics number 27 was a story called The Case of the Chemical Syndicate, which is I don't want to say verbatim, but it's definitely a simplified version of Partners of Peril, which is a Shadow story. Oddly enough, it wasn't written by longtime Shadow writer Maxwell Grant. It was written by Theodore Tinsley, I believe, which was he was more well known as the writer for Doc Savage. So I mean, if you become interested at all in the Shadow, I would recommend picking up. Anthony Tolan is responsible for this publishing company that has published double novels.
Yeah, they do novels. Avenger double novels. They do Doc Savage, The Shadow, of course.
So the Shadow number 9 has the Partners of Peril story and is dedicated to the inspirations for Batman. There's 2 stories in particular that greatly inspired Batman. There's forewords and little editorials within by Batman scribes and Shadow scribes. Jerry Robinson does a foreword that detail in depth just how great the impact of the Shadow had on Batman. Bill Finger, who quote unquote wrote Case of the Chemical Syndicate, was an ardent admirer of Walter Gibson, aka Maxwell Grant. His pen name for the Shadow stories was Maxwell Grant. Mainly, their main inspiration is the Creature of the Night. And you may think, looking back, that seems like, oh, that's not really a ripoff, that's just something. But really, I mean, Dracula, the Shadow, Batman,
Nosferatu. Not thematically, but as a concept. It's a evolution that is not...
It's that idea, there are so many, it's written in panels where Commissioner Weston or Commissioner Gordon are talking to someone, they turn around, he's gone. I mean, you could just substitute the Weston or Gordon, and I mean, it writes as a Batman story, it writes as a Shadow story. That's something that Batman took from the Shadow, that he's there one moment, he's gone the next. The all black garb, especially in the garb of the villain. Like the Shadow's cloak and everything is what, like, the stage persona of the villain. Like, kind of like what you Snidely Whiplash type, it's very much,
Absolutely. And like just the villain who kind of like twirls his mustache, even though the Shadow doesn't do that, but then throws his cloak around his face.
Right.
And the Shadow has a bandana basically around the bottom of his face to hide himself as a bank robber or a villain would do.
Which
right?
has the, like that, famous, Toulouse-Lautrec, painting. I forget the person that's, there. I have it written down somewhere here, but, that's the inspiration for that. Let's see. This is Bill Finger speaking about that. My idea was to have Batman be a combination of Douglas Fairbanks, Sherlock Holmes, The Shadow, and Doc Savage as well. And that was him discussing the alterations he made to Kane's original concept, which if you've ever seen Bob Kane's original concept of Batman, you'll realize that never would have made it past issue number 1.
His name is Batman. Maybe you should make him look like a bat instead of someone wielding a baseball bat.
Right. In Walter Gibson's own words, he said Batman was a clowned up version of the Shadow. And that's very appropriate. Like, the Shadow's he has a more interesting backstory, a more complex backstory, but when you're talking about the character design, it's more just, with all the flourishes and everything, he's just the basic, cape, cowl, fedora, or slouch hat, whatever. You can point out the millionaire playboy Bruce Wayne, millionaire playboy Lamont Cranston. You can argue that was with Zorro as well. There's a couple other pulp characters, but really most of them came afterwards. But especially with them, they had a personal relationship with the police commissioner, and that was the thing. And they portrayed this lackadaisical, laissez-faire type person that helped disguise their nocturnal activities. The Batcave and the Sanctum, once again, the Zorro was the precursor, and you could argue that the Shadow kind of copied that, and by default Batman copied from the Shadow, and you wouldn't be wrong in stating that. But the similarities between the Shadow and the Batman really start to blend more so than with the Shadow and Zorro. Especially
also like the origin of traveling to East Asia,
Right, I was getting into that. Like, their backstory, the whatever, it's Tibet, the Tulku, whatever. Their origin story, you don't need to look farther than the 94 Shadow movie, what they glimmered from that to Batman Begins. You can definitely see their origin stories are almost identical, except Lamont Cranston was already in that environment. He was more of a, depending on who's telling the origin story, kind of a drug runner. He had like kind of a clan back there, and then was either voluntarily or involuntarily made to repent. Whereas Batman spent his life getting to that point. Both had I guess you'd say, a foundation of skills before they entered that I guess in both instances you'd call it their final test or their final trials, kind of like the Herculean trials. It's very similar, and that's something that only these two characters, in my knowledge, share, or it's definitely one took after the other. The use of 45s. In the early days of Batman carried a gun. The Shadow obviously carried his twin 45s, or sometimes one 45. But that's something obviously taken from one after the other.
If I could just make something like if you've read First Wave, which was Doc Savage, Batman, Batman's using
and the Spirit, right?
And the Spirit, right? Batman's using dual 45s in that as well,
right. Because it's taken from the 40s Batman, the early 40s Batman. That's he's not time traveling back to Doc Savage or vice versa. And Bob Kane said in regard to that, we didn't think there was anything wrong with Batman using a gun because the Shadow used one. That was his remark about Batman having a gun. And they realized that they were wrong. Batman's utility belt and the Shadow's gadgets. Batman had suction gloves and knee pads in 1939 that mimicked the Shadows from 1932, that enabled him to climb up skyscrapers. That was kind of a reoccurring theme in both characters. Batman's black cape, Obviously, that's from 1939, but the Shadow's cloak from 1931. There's not much to be said about, like, Zorro wore a cape, but how they used that cape, how it made them become a part of the night or part of the shadows, help them blend into the background. That's where they're very similar.
Absolutely. And I could say another difference, obviously, like Zorro influence, but Zorro comes in, riding a horse or something,
Right.
like
daylight adventures, the Shadow and Batman nighttime adventures.
That's exactly what,
Batman had explosives and smoke pellets. So did the Shadow. He had the finger snap explosive where he would snap, it's an old magician's trick, 2 chemicals on the opposing digits. You snap your fingers and it creates like a flash grenade or something like that. The Bat Plane or the Bat Gyro from 1939 or 1940. The Shadow's Auto Gyro from 1932 helped them get around town. The Bat Family and the Agents of the Shadow, and the callous way that Batman interacts with his Bat Family mimics the Shadow's relationship with his agents. If anything, if you were to compare their relationships, you would think Batman would be Father of the Year after you seeing how the Shadow treats his agents. It's not like that he's, he definitely will go out of his way to save their lives, but he makes no mistake in telling them that they are dispensable to them. Not indispensable like Batman's family. They are dispensable. Their sole purpose is protect innocent civilians. His agents are people that have either tried to commit suicide or wasted their lives or should have been dead if not for the Shadow's involvement, and therefore they're living on borrowed time.
Yeah.
And their borrowed time is meant to help other people's lives, or save other people's lives who are there and then in turn become more agents of the Shadow. So I love that, just storyline or that.
It's like the concept of having a team of people.
I mean, it's even more of a team. It's like an entire underworld in the city that it knows that this fictional character is a real person, that they're also dedicated to him that it stays a secret. And, depending on how it's depicted in the, the pulps or the comics, they have the ring or they have a signal or they're passing notes with, vanishing ink or, just a really interesting
cryptograms and things like that. It's
really
awesome stuff.
Yeah.
I'd like to say something real quick too. Obviously, we talked about the differences between Batman's reasons for having, his family, because it's family, shadows, or agents. Batman, there was that Mr. Freeze story that we read that he kind of tried this idea with like an agency.
Right.
And it failed miserably for Batman.
Yeah, with that artist that right, which just definitely seemed to harken back to the Shadow.
Absolutely.
Obviously I mentioned Commissioner Gordon, Commissioner Weston, or Commissioner Wainwright Barth, the relationship that the Shadow has with these people, vigilante, or even their alter egos have with the Commissioner on a more personal level. One's directly inspired from the other. Both masters of disguise, both master detectives, both trained in the Orient Tibet, both masters of martial arts. I mean, the list goes on. There are much more similarities than differences between these two characters.
Yeah, like Matches Malone, like as an alias or something.
Yeah.
Shadow did that all the time. Batman does that. Not as much anymore, but still, like, that's a concept of Batman that I think is very much inspired. I wouldn't say ripoff, but it's very cool.
I mean, he shows his love in their crossovers, or, the Shadow's definitely been mentioned glowingly as the inspiration for Batman. I just wanted to read this short excerpt, and you can see how other pulp characters had an impact on Batman. Is just what the character he intended to assume would be was still vague in his mind. He only knew that it would have to be some nebulous creature of the night that lurked in the shadows. Then he swung around, suddenly tense. In the shadows above his head came a slithering, flapping sort of sound. As the creature hovered over a lamp for an instant, it cast a huge shadow on the cabin wall. "That's it," exclaimed Claude aloud. "I'll call myself the Bat." And you think this is the Batman. This is the Bat from 1934, penned by future Batman editor Jack Schiff. So the Black Bat or the Bat, these were pulp characters. That's the Bat, the origin story, how he came to embody the personage of or the shape of the Bat. And if you were to read that, you'd think that that's the Batman's origin story from, 1940, where the bat flies through the window or whatever. But I don't think there's any, coincidence that story, like I said, was penned by future Batman editor Jack Schiff. Batman's utility belt could also be argued to have direct correlation on Doc Savage's vest. The Joker, the Whisperer was a ripoff, I guess you can call, or a character inspired by would be a more polite way to say it, off the Shadow. He had a character called the Joker from 1937. The Shadow had a character called the Harlequin from 1939, the same, only months before the Joker made his first appearance.
You were saying to me that you think that's more of the inspiration for the Joker than The Man Who Laughs, or the.
Oh yeah, I mean there's, I believe, even like the Whisper Joker, like he's a clown-faced mobster that kills people with a grin. I believe even the Joker's alias is named as James Gordon. I mean, so it's kind of hard to argue that Bill Finger read that book, especially when it came out months before Batman's first appearance. The Bat Signal. There were red lights that were atop the Clarion Tower that summoned the Phantom Detective, which is another pulp mystery man. And, the Shadow has gone on to inspire many other characters, including, most notably, I would say, or other than Batman, V for Vendetta.
Sure. And also, you may have this later in the agenda, but Darkman.
You're right.
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah, we'll definitely get into that, like, as far as the movie history. So, I guess, well, I don't know. We can start with the history, like the pulp novels.
Yeah, I would like to actually, as someone who has broad knowledge of comics, before comics, there were pulp novels. Right.
So,
that before the comic art form, as we know it today, existed, these characters that you could call comic book characters existed in novel form.
Except, if for all you pulp novel enthusiasts out there that may be listening to this episode on a fluke, they're called mystery men. Do not piss these people off. Mystery men. They're not superheroes.
The concept of that hero, though, labeled as a mystery man, existed in the pulps. So you have the Avenger, you have the Shadow, you have Doc Savage, probably missing 1,000 more.
Yeah.
These books were put out, and at the time we were reading about how Walter Gibson was making like $700 a story or something like that.
I mean, he was making big buku bucks.
Yeah. Bucks.
Yeah.
And it was enjoyed. I mean, people read them, people threw them away. That's why you were saying it's very difficult to find original pulp novels today, right?
I mean, they're rare. I think that, like,
imagine finding, I'm sorry to interrupt, like Detective 27's from 38. The Shadow pulps were before that.
Well, and they're really, their name comes from the pulp paper that they were printed on. It's wood pulp. They're very cheap paper. They were like, it's like, think about newspaper. Like, it's really hard to find a pristine newspaper from 1931.
It is,
unless they grab that off the newsstand, put it in glass right away. I mean, I don't know. They're out there, but quite often too, like, and they talk about it in the Shadow Nose documentary where they, newsstand, people would rip off the covers to pretend like they couldn't sell it, like they were sold on consignment, and then sell it without the covers.
The concept, right? The concept behind that, and you'll even read paperback novels that have a warning that says, notice, if you purchase this book without a cover, the author nor the publisher received any money. The reason for that is they sent those covers back to say that they destroyed them, because it's expensive to ship, a lot of paper. They do that and then sell the comic, or you can do that, or the book, doubling up their money, which is a big scam that was, I don't know. It's almost like piracy, I guess.
So I guess we can get into, like, so the Shadow, even though he's a pulp character was actually created for radio first. And the way he was created for radio was kind of like what you'd know as like the Crypt Keeper on the Tales from the Crypt show, or Rod Sterling. The early days, he was voiced by Frank Reddick. Before that, Henry Charlot. He was described as just pretty much like the Crypt Keeper, the original Crypt Keeper from the comics. He was a hooded type character, a specter of death, who just had a evil looking, or evil sounding voice, laughed and said, "The Shadow knows." Nothing else to him. So then, and this was, he hosted the Street and Smith Detective Story Hour. So then this story hour became so popular that, people would go to the newsstand asking for that Shadow character from the pulps. And they realized, well, they had a money-making opportunity here, and worse off, if they didn't come up with a Shadow story, one of their competitors would. So they had to rush something out to print, and meanwhile, just so happened, Walter Gibson was walking through asking for a job. Now, Walter Gibson is probably a more or just as interesting of a character as Lamont Cranston of The Shadow. He ghostwrote for Harry Houdini, Harry Thurston, many magicians. He wrote magic card, rule books or card playing rule books for Hoyle. I think I even inadvertently had one of those books before I even knew who the Shadow was. I mean, they're still in print. I think he wrote over 100 books on magic, prestidigitation, card playing, before he even got into the Shadow game. So the publisher, I think it was Blackstone, recognized that Walter Gibson was known for having a fast output, like he could write fast. As a matter of fact, I think he wrote roughly about 300 Shadow stories within a 15-year period. He averaged about 10,000 words a day. Like, if you want to feel lazy about yourself, that should really be able to drive the nail in to the coffin, 10,000 words a day. And granted, not all of his stories are they're not the Great Gatsby by any means. And even as far as pulps are concerned, if I would more readily recommend Dashiell Hammett or Raymond Chandler. But he did something in creating this whole mythos, this character, and just the sheer output. And there's still a certain level of quality there. I can pick up any Shadow book and expect a certain level of quality, and sometimes be surprised at when he goes way above that. So they're never bad reads, but I there's definitely a different level, of different things. And I don't mean that to disparage Walter Gibson at all. I think he was a brilliant writer, brilliant man. He had brilliant ideas. So he took this idea of the Shadow and pretty much gradually started to form this character that we know, or roughly know today. Even to this day, he's a very complex, convoluted character that's kind of his gimmick. Is even his agents, he's kind of, I compare him a lot to the Joker's origin story, where yes, you could say the Killing Joke is the origin story, but then again, he even says in that book, if he's got an origin, he prefers it to be multiple choice. Sometimes I remember it one way, sometimes another. The Shadow is very similar to that. And we'll get into a little bit of his origin a little bit later in the show.
I also wanted to say, because of this, it might be a little daunting to get into this character. And would you say, Joe, that don't be intimidated by that if you've never read The Shadow? Kind of just maybe jump into whatever grabs you.
I think you know enough, and then you'll be surprised when you find out different things about him. And once again, we can get into a little bit, shortly on. But if all you know is he's Lamont Cranston, you have the power, the basic blurb in the that starts every radio program. That's all you really need to know. Even even in the pulps, it's not always clear that he's, using invisibility. He's just like a ninja.
Yeah, it's not even so much about knowing the mythology. It's just sitting back for a fun ride. Yeah. We'll get into this later with the pulp that we do, but there's very little setup, and you're just reading this noir story that's in print, and it kind of just takes you to a different place.
We can get to it actually relatively shortly. So they wanted him to give a pen name because in Street and Smith's mind, in case Walter Gibson didn't work out or quit or whatever, they wanted a name that they could say, like, he continued to write. Like, so that's what they did a lot with many pulp writers. He came up with the name Maxwell Grant. He got to pick his own name. So that way, even though there were other people that go through it for Maxwell Grant later on, there was always Maxwell Grant. It wasn't Theodore Tinsley or anything else like that. So that's why there's only a couple later on with the Shadow Returns that he actually uses his real name, Walter Gibson, but they're one and the same person. So I guess in preparation for this, we talked about, I had you read the first appearance of the Shadow. The first pulp he ever wrote was The Living Shadow. And once again, there's really no backstory to the Shadow. It kind of, like you were just saying, it kind of throws you right in it.
Yeah, and so it takes place from, I guess, is the Shadow's first agent, which is Harry Vincent.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. Well, he's not his first agent. He's I guess the first one that you see it through his eyes.
There are other agents of it. Yeah, there's also the insurance Farwell.
Now you got me confused.
No, I can tell you right now. Yeah. So what I meant by that is that it's not his first agent because the other agents existed before the Fellows.
Yeah, Claude Fellows is actually, there's a little bit of trivia there. Claude Fellows is the only agent to die in The Line of Fire. He actually only appears once more and he's killed.
Wow.
So even though he's the one that introduces everything, he might not be the only one. But he's one of the ones that you were introduced to. You think you build up a relationship and he's killed. So it lets you, like, as the stories go on, the pulps, it lets you realize, no, you're not. I mean, you could follow Harry Vincent, even though Harry Vincent never dies. I won't spoiler, but it does set that up where he could die. I mean, they're not immune to it. And it's not like comic book mythology where, he might come back as the Red Hood, 20 years from now. No, he's dead. He's definitely dead. So, but yeah, it follows, and if you've ever seen the 94 Shadow movie, the opening scene with the Shadow is kind of like an homage to Harry Vincent. He's going to kill himself.
So, correct. So it starts off with this man who is completely, down on his luck. He has nothing to live for. He is about to jump off the bridge. Shadow approaches him and straight up stops him from killing himself.
The way he described it, he just leans forward till he sees a car coming. Once they're gone, he leans forward, and the Shadow, he stops. Right. He doesn't even see anyone, and then he's pulled back, and he describes the way it's described sometimes like, just like,
it's a force. It's
right.
You're compelled, like right. Almost. So
he's asking a question, but he's not asking. It's often a lot of what the people say.
He is, yeah. He's straight up using hypnosis or mind control. It's not that you just feel compelled. I also kind of wanted to bring up this dynamic of like master slave. It's sort of like a. I don't know. I think there's something to be read into that a little bit. You know right. What I mean?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, that's something that's definitely Howard Chaykin played into. Matt Wagner plays into it, or even in the Batman Shadow book that later on, like that they resent calling him master now, like but back then, like they called him master. He's their master. Like that's one of the things the movie got. Like he says, like I saved your life, it now belongs to me.
Absolutely. So we're going to get into the story, I guess. So he is stopped by that, and who is to like decide that for someone, So but right away,
he does have free will, though. He says right there, he's like, you don't have to take me up. I can drop you right off of that bridge and you can kill yourself.
That is true. But is he implying that and it's not true? Like, you know what I mean? I guess you're right. He does set him up
I think
very well,
it's kind of like, I give you an offer you can't refuse. He right. assures him, like, the reasons he's killing himself, you don't have to worry about money anymore. I'm going to give you a life that has and that's kind of like what everyone dreams about, right? Like, that's why there's that apocalyptic, like wet dream that everyone loves to think that they're like, cause you don't have to deal with the normal mundane day-to-day problems of paying bills. You can just go out and hunt for food and make a difference and do all this, but most people would just die, right? I mean, They just have this
People,
ego.
yeah. Like, can you start a fire? No, you're dead.
Yeah.
Like,
An animal, no.
like,
right?
yeah. Do you need?
It's kind of like that. Like, oh, if someone gave me the opportunity to like be fucking just not even like be the vigilante because like you would die. Like someone that's so good. Like if Batman came up to you and be like, I want you to be my Robin, whatever. I don't care about your training. I don't give a shit about that. I just need someone to spy occasionally here and there. I'm gonna give you a good wage.
For sure. So he's why are you going to kill yourself? He's like, this woman. So he's going to kill himself over a woman. He says he has like $1.38 in his pocket or something like that.
Like it's a realistic. He went out to New York to make a name for himself or to be successful. He hasn't even had the decency to call back home, and they don't realize he's got a couple cents to his name, and it's just like that's it. Like he found out that his girl back home got married, and that he has nothing else to live for.
So he turns this guy's life around under the condition that he lives for the Shadow because his life belongs to him. So he gets into a cab, right? Shadow disappears.
Well, not right. So as they're going over this, there's some weird thing that happens that they're pretty much, there's a carjacking. They're unbeknownst, like they try and jack the car, and all that he describes the action like he just sees like, and that's how most often the Shadow's described as like, there's a shadow there, but it's bigger than it should be or darker than it should be. So this guy comes into the back seat because they're driving a limo and he's trying to rob them. And then he's enveloped in the shadow. All he sees is a shot, and then there's blood. So he must have got shot with his own gun, and he's thrown out the back window. And then the shadow guy's gone. And so he goes to accost the driver, which is so that's the one other thing too. And you have to think in the history of it. And I know there's different arguments to this, like I believe the chauffeur's name is Jericho Druk. They don't call him by name in this, but Jericho Druk was one of the first, he's a black chauffeur. I mean, he's a positive, he's a huge dude. He's an agent of the Shadow. He's an awesome character. It's very rare to see African Americans portrayed in such a heroic way. And Walter Gibson did it very early on. However, if you're going to read, and you'll see a lot of it with the Celestials, quote unquote, or Orientals, which by the way, I think I don't get, if I was Asian, I would love that. I think Oriental just sounds so elegant. I don't get why that's a faux pas term, but that's just me. Maybe I don't know the history of it. Maybe I don't understand it.
It's not for us to argue.
Yeah, okay, you don't like it, that's fine. But you gotta understand the history of the times, right? Like Maxwell Grant, Walter Gibson didn't mean anything by it, but he definitely writes in the tongue. He tries to write out the Asian,
manner of
accents,
speech,
right.
like
or the black,
cadence.
yes, some soup.
So
right.
yeah, maybe let's preface that when you go into this, you need to read it from the lens of that time. And
Right.
it's not anything that's meant to piss anyone off. So, right, as you were saying, it's written, what's the word for that? Like, it's written as they would speak, like you were
Right,
saying,
right.
like, when
And that's how they would speak. I mean, I don't think there's anything wrong saying that. I mean, there is an Asian dialect. He's not saying it over the top.
No.
Right.
I think it was just to give them characterization. So
Right.
when we'll get to that part
There are
later
strong,
on.
I would just say there are strong black and Asian, characters throughout Walter Gibson's story.
Yeah, and Jewish.
Right. Yeah. That are great throughout. So yeah, look, I know some people, even silent films, they'll look back and well, that's just racist. No matter how you look at it, it's racist. I'm people say to look through the lens of history, but that's just, I'm like, really? Well, look, let's go back 20 years ago and think what you thought about, did you use gay in it? In a direct term, it's, cause I can say, in high school, we dropped, fag and gay all the time and didn't think anything of it. So I'm guilty of it too. So I don't think it's,
When I said that, you have to look at it through the lens of the time.
I agree with you.
Yeah,
I
right.
agree. Some people I think are just, unrealistic in their expectations of history, even recently with Trump and that Durbin, from our Illinois senator, he said, I was shocked that any president ever used the wording I heard back then. I'm like, really? Cause I think LBJ's on tape saying a lot worse. Or you think that Andrew Jackson didn't say a lot worse than that? I mean, I'm not defending Trump, but I find it ludicrous that you think that no president ever said anything racist in the Oval Office. I think that's ridiculous. Anyway, but yeah.
Sure. Okay.
Sorry, I got off on a tangent.
That's okay. But yeah, so I think what the point we were also trying to make is that Maxwell Grant, Walter Gibson was trying to incorporate all sorts of people from all over. Like especially when you're talking about the driver, as Jericho
Druk.
So is definitely a positive black character in fiction very early on during a time when black people weren't even on TV. You know, well, TV didn't exist, but they're I think my point is clear.
And we don't have to get through all like the plot going forward. All of a sudden, you know, he's spying on some people. There's a lot of great, like, that's the one great thing about Walter Gibson is because he comes from that background of like, you know, prestidigitation and all these, he just has such a fondness for codes. Like one of my favorite codes in there is they find this code where it's just two numbers, like, you know, 184,71, and they're trying to figure out, and it turns out it's this guy's dictionary. So they turn to page 184, the 71st word down is the part of the code, and they just do, it's a standard, you know, supplementation, like, type code. And there's a bunch like that. You know, even like
it's fantastic. So that's, you know, is that called stenography or
cryptography?
Cryptography. Report to fellows company. So like he hears the story.
So he'll get a phone call and he'll tell people like you'll hear it. And that's one of the great things that you know, you can use your imagination when reading the pulp, but the Shadow says you'll know what words to remember. So it's just by, and no one else will. Like, so it's not a matter of like, come to you know, room 2, wink, wink. It's more like he's saying it, but just because he's an agent, he knows what words. No one else does.
So you know? I think one of the best examples of that is probably this one that we're talking about when the detective calls, Vincent. He is telling there was a murder next door, which is, you know.
Not yet, but he says, I think you're talking about, he says, your watch is ready, we'll send it up to your room. And it turns out to be like, watch the man in the next room, like that, like that.
Sure. So, okay, so we'll go into that first then. Then he overhears, two people in the hotel room over, I believe that was room 1419, who he was actually getting mail for. He's in room 1417. He has been he's been told by the Shadow to trail this guy, right? And he like goes to a theater or whatever. He's like following him all day. The man in the next room, kills the guy in there by like putting a pillow over his face and shooting him or something like that. Yeah. And he like quickly goes back into his room and says that he like didn't see anything. The house detective, but he got this disc that while he was over there. Is that correct?
Which is actually the cool thing about that is that disc appears frequently throughout the pulp.
Yeah.
Like that disc is kind of an underworld thing with Chinatown. But we really, unless you're getting to a point, I don't really want to get, because this plot is so long.
Well, the twists and turns. What I'm really getting to is the next one, the next clue, which is after the murder happens, the house detective says, did you hear the report of the gun? And like he uses that as like the word report to fellows company. To your earlier point about the cryptograms.
Yeah, so it just keeps going on. Like, there's a lot of, and that's the great thing about his novels. Like, they typically follow a different agent. Like, Harry Vincent's one of the number one agents that you will follow quite often. Lamont Cranston and Margot Lane appear later on, but, Margot Lane didn't appear until I believe the late 40s, in the pulps at least. But the Shadow is kind of like not a tertiary, a secondary character, I guess. Like, he's definitely in these books, but he's not he's not the protagonist. Yeah. Like, you definitely get enough of him to satiate your desire, but he's definitely in the shadows. You know, one of my, there are just so many reveals. Like, it's like you'll have someone, just the descriptives that they use. Some guy, there'll be a meeting between mobsters, and that's how they describe, like, some guy will look over in the corner of the room and, like, that shadow in the corner is unusually dark. Like, you know, and they'll just think nothing, and then all of a sudden, like, they'll be talking to look over, and that shadow's gone, and it's strange. And you'll hear, like, laughter. He swears he heard some maniacal laughter coming from the gangway below. Yeah, I don't know, it's just great, you know.
It's those pulpy, noirish things where
purple prose,
absolutely,
you know, just drips off of, you know, you know. But I think it's just full of these little things. So what I love about, like, for my money, Living Shadow's not one of my favorites, and it tops a lot of people's favorites. I do think that the first half of the book kind of was a little slow moving, and then there were great things about it because that carjacking in the beginning did end up having a payoff at the end. Like there's the mobsters are talking, and they're talking about this rumor of the shadow, and they're talking about a carjacking that happened. And they're now you see that same story from the perspective of the mobster, of the gangsters, that they went to jack this limousine, and all of a sudden this like enveloping cloud of blackness took this guy out. And just the way they describe it, it's kind of like that Batman story where everyone like just sees like the Batman as this huge demonic figure, right, and all that. Yeah. So,
it's like an urban legend sort of thing that's passed around by gangsters, and it's very real.
And the way they tied in with the radio show, even this early on, they talk about how that they believe, and they've had people scout the radio, tower, because the shadow, they know him from the radio program, which is, keep in mind, is a real thing back then. And that he introduces these crime programs to like, that they're real stories that he had some involvement with to prevent crime, to show that people that crime doesn't pay. And he's actually the announcer for these programs. And they've tried, and they say that they describe it as like, it's a velvet room. No one ever sees anyone go in. No one ever sees anyone come out. But the announcer, he's always on time, like that kind of thing. I love.
It's total, it's, what's the word I'm looking for? It really grabs you. It really is like something that is trying to set this not interactive, but like real world thing.
Right.
So back then there was no internet to go on and be like, is this bullshit? There was no TV really. So when you're listening to this and like, let's say it was me and you in the 30s and we're like, is this fucking real? Like, let's go check this out.
That
like
War of the Worlds type thing. And even the War of the World is over embellished, but it has that same impact here. Like each pulp story starts with like, the Shadow's signature, and he testifies that the events, within are, I certify that everything in this story is true and accurate, and as told to by my raconteur, Maxwell Grant, I certify this to be an actual accounting of these events, signed the Shadow. So that people, like, especially kids reading this, thought, like, it was a way, as Maxwell Grant said, to prevent kids from, going into a life of crime, because they thought this shadow is kind of like a Santa Claus type character. Like he can see you. He knows when you've been good or bad. Like he's as inevitable as a guilty conscience, that type of thing.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's like no disclaimer at the end that says like, this is a work of fiction.
Yeah. And then there's that Batman, like I said, I don't want to give away everything, but there's a moment where like, they have that meeting of the mobsters. There's this guy, and as he's pulling away, he's like, look over in the corner over there. It turns out to be the double of the guy, and the shadow was disguised as this other mobster in very like something you would see in the pages of Batman. Obviously done first in the shadow,
Yes. And that, like you were saying, the purple prose, the dialogue between some of these guys, especially when like the gangsters are talking, it really pulls you into, and you can almost hear their voices speak. So I don't know what else. What else are we summing up with this?
Like, I don't even like not reviewing it. I don't know. I enjoyed it. I think it's a good delving in, tipping your toe.
Yeah.
I would recommend, maybe starting off the comics, and we'll get into that. But if you like the comics, maybe pick up a pulp or two. I'm sure you can find on, people's personal top 10 choices. Living Shadow generally makes people's top 10s. I don't think I'd put on my top, but I don't know. There's 300 Shadow novels to choose from. If you're listening to this, you're probably a Batman fan. Maybe you want to pick up issue 9 of the double novels to see just how much of an impact he had on Batman.
If you want, like the double novels that are published by, what was the name of the company?
I forget. Nostalgia Ventures, but I think it changes later on.
Sure.
You can find it very easily.
I would also like to see, a lot of this stuff is almost like public archive type stuff. So a lot of it's available on...
No.
Condé
Nast rules their patent with an iron thumb. Hence why we don't have a Shadow movie. Otherwise, he'd be as commonplace as Sherlock Holmes. Like Condé Nast...
The pulp novels?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the Shadow is definitely not public domain. I almost wish at this point
not the whole character and not the whole like library of material, but a lot of it is available.
Yeah,
for example, like the radio program is available for free as a podcast, like certain episodes at least.
But
yeah,
it's kind of hard to keep track of that, and I don't know like where that goes off. A lot of them have been lost. Same with the pulps. I think a lot of it comes down to it. Like they were out of print for so long that in order to, like you can't pay $10,000 for something from the 1930s, so people just uploaded PDFs of it. And
sure.
Thank God they did.
So what I was getting at is if you
Tolan did this, I had no way of getting like many of these stories.
Absolutely. Is this so? It's fine to say. I think if you just Google "Living Shadow," the first thing that comes up is a PDF.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
and Anthony Tolan has not reprinted those because they were reprinted in the 70s, the first couple, like 10 stories. And in his mind, he didn't want to do that because they're still somewhat accessible. And I understand that a little bit, but still, like, I would like to have it in this nicer format rather than reading a musty old book.
Yeah, yeah. Plus, like, reading a PDF off the internet kind of sucks. So, check it out.
Yeah.
Before we join the shadow in today's adventure, here's a proposition. Regardless of what coal you're now burning in your furnace, order a ton of blue coal. Try blue coal for a week and see if it doesn't give you more even, more dependable, longer-lasting heat. That's fair enough, isn't it? And remember, when you order blue coal, you get courteous, careful delivery and helpful consideration of all your heating problems. Phone your neighborhood blue coal dealer tomorrow. And be sure to hold on till the end of this program. You'll want to hear our special guest of the evening.
So now we can kind of discuss like a little bit of like the Shadow's history himself. He's kind of this, so it kind of depends on where you go. I'm going to go with the most flushed out version of his history. And once again, this is kind of like based on, whoever wrote it, he doesn't have the continuing written history like Batman did, but you've had like writers like Frank Miller come in, like what Frank Miller did for Batman, like Matt Wagner may have done a little bit of, Howard Chaykin may have done a little bit of, obviously Maxwell Grant had a huge part in it, and everyone's, had a little bit of forming this history, but most of it comes from Maxwell Grant. So he starts off as a pilot in World War I, Kent Allard. And he was over France. Some people say he was a French pilot, but he was kind of like the Red Baron type. Like he shot down a lot of pilots. He was called the Black Eagle, I think it was, or something like that. Dark Eagle.
I think you're right.
Yeah. So he was also a spy. Some stories have him as a drug runner or up to some sort of illicit, but mainly like the main crux of it, like he was notorious as like just killing Germans, and then eventually was shot down and did spy work, like helped release POWs, and then became MIAs. Like he never returned home. And so most stories have him in some. Now he goes from Kent Allard to Ying Ko, which he's maybe like I guess the head of a cartel in the Orient. He's got his harem of women. He's got his little gang. Some stories have him as a blonde, blue-haired, and 6 foot, and that's why the Chinese or the Asians took to him, because he's so against everything or so different from everyone around there. Others have just like have him look kind of like what he looks like in the pulps or comic books, the hawkish features and all that. Usually, and Howard Chaykin does go into more detail with his series of stories. One of his customers with the drugs is Lamont Cranston. And there is an uncanny resemblance between Kent Allard and Lamont Cranston. And they become somewhat friends. Lamont Cranston is pretty much what Bruce Wayne pretends to be. He's a globe-trotting playboy, big game hunter. He has a mansion in New York, but he's never home. Like, he's always just going around, fucking women, shooting rhinos and shooting up
doing
heroin.
Some big game hunting.
Much, right. So, and then once again, depending on the writer, Yinko is either abducted by the Tolku or, and some one of his harem members is killed, or like he has a feud with a rebel tribe. And they kill like his beloved, and he goes to seek revenge, or like I said, he's kidnapped and forced to repent for his crimes at like a la the 94 movie, and which they teach him to cloud men's minds through force of concentration so they cannot see him. And it's pretty much just martial arts mixed with a little samurai ninja type stuff, and just hypnotism, mesmerism, that kind of thing. So the way that they usually describe his powers is like it's not like he can stand in front of you in a well-lit room and like I'm invisible and you don't see him, like kind of like that. And depending on how susceptible you are, like people talk about, the different tiers of enlightenment.
Sure.
So based on that, like he can make you think he's someone that he's not. Like, so that's how he makes people think he's Lamont Cranston when he's not, even though he doesn't look like Lamont Cranston in most stories. You're not enlightened. I'm Lamont Cranston. And despite he doesn't have to disguise himself with anything.
I wanted to kind of get into it. So like when Bruce Wayne dresses as matches Malone, he has maybe some face putty on or something, and it's an actual disguise. This concept is, a little bit more abstract than that what you were getting into. The Shadow uses these powers of persuasion and mind. I don't know what to say.
That's the usual telling, and that's the story I like to stick with, is that, he doesn't really look like Lamont Cranston, and that's why Margot Lane kind of when Margot Lane knew the real Lamont Cranston, and her first remark is you're taller now, and she kind of sees a little bit he's not quite Lamont Cranston.
It's the ability to alter people's perception of him that changes.
So it's not so strong that he could be completely invisible. However, it's nighttime. He's wearing all black. He's standing in a corner. It's a little easier to make that blur the line of reality and be like, this is a shadow right here.
Right.
As long as I'm not dancing the Charleston, throwing a bunch of detention to you, I could probably pull a fast one over most people. But there are people that he comes up against that are more enlightened that he does not have that ability with. He also has his Girasol ring, the fire opal, that helps him kind of it's kind of like a token that helps him, with these abilities, helps him hypnotize someone. His powers also usually extend to being able to hypnotize someone to get the truth out of someone or to do his bidding, that kind of thing.
Something I kind of want to compare it to, you watch Game of Thrones, right?
Yeah.
So the faceless men, Arya becomes a girl has no name. Think of that a little bit, and I would say somewhat similar to the Shadow.
So after he's got his training and all that, he decides to go to New York, and then he remembers Lamont Cranston, how he's never home, so he decides to take on the persona of Lamont Cranston. People obviously realize he's different, but he's able to keep up this little visage. What am I thinking?
Facade. Rouge.
Facade. Yeah.
Ruse.
That he's Lamont Cranston. Margot Lane puts two and two together, but eventually Lamont Cranston does return home, and the Shadow pretty much just says, "You're an agent of mine. Just leave. Get out of here. I'm taking over your New York, thing. I'm going to take your money. There's nothing you can do about it. At this point, I've been home longer than you have. So even if we were going to go to court or whatever, people would believe I'm Lamont Cranston, not you. So there's not much Lamont Cranston can do about it other than spend the rest of his days in Europe. Occasionally comes back home and, helps out a little bit. Some other stories have him as more of a villain role, like Howard Chaykin. But that's kind of and even then, with the Kent Allard backstory, it's alluded to that he's even someone other than Kent Allard, that even before that he was using a persona. So that's where I think, even the 94 movie, they dumb it down. And I think it's so complex that some people don't like that, or it's hard to follow. I love that. That's what puts him above Batman for me, is just that rich history, that rich origin story.
And if you want to get a distinct, I don't know, chronology, or if you're trying to fit all this into one box, would you say it's possible? I don't think it's worth doing, kind of. You have to kind of let go of that timeline of progression. Do you understand what I'm saying?
Not quite.
So, for example, in the radio drama, the identity was dropped for simplicity's sake, to kind of make everything fit into one, continuity. is impossible.
I don't think so. I think Matt Wagner did an excellent job in year one, a fantastic job, and I think most people do. I mean, I kind of just broke it down in a way. I didn't want to state definitive facts because there are variants to this story, but there is a more concrete path down that way that I tend to ascribe as like the origin story of the Shadow, that I like as my origin story of the Shadow. But that's not the same for everyone, so I want to be clear on that. For sure. I think it's great. I love it. It's unique. It's not like, I mean, I love Batman's origin story, but there are so many people. Yeah, someone close to you died. You know, you vowed revenge. Blah blah blah. You trained for a while. Like it's become like the most blasé like superhero origin story. Whereas the Shadow, I think, is truly unique. I've never heard of anything similar at all. But I will say, saying that if they can pull off the Doc Savage movie, come on, what's the holdup on a Shadow movie? Because the Shadow is just a more interesting Doc Savage, more interesting,
Well, it's we were talking about earlier. It's rights issues, right?
Yeah. Once again, we can get into it a little bit more.
Absolutely.
So obviously, as his agents, we can get into Harry Vincent, who was he's kind of like the. I always thought of him as like a young Cary Elwes.
Sure.
But he's kind of like, a socialite. Mo Shrevnitz was the cab driver. Margot Lane replaced Harry Vincent in the radio show because it was easier to have to differentiate between a male and female voice than two males. So that's why Margot Lane came about, but she became, once again, a socialite. And so we can get into her with Matt Wagner's take on year one. Clyde Burke is a newspaper reporter who's also paid to collect news clippings for the Shadow. Burbank is a radio operator who maintains contact between the Shadow and his agents. Cliff Marsland. He is a man with a checkered past who changed his name to Clifford Marsland. He spent years in Sing Sing for a crime he did not commit and is wrongly believed to have murdered one or more people by the underworld. He infiltrates gangs using his crooked reputation. He's kind of like the Matches Malone of the agents. Dr. Rupert Sayer is the Shadow's personal physician. Jericho Druk is a giant, immensely strong black man. He's also his chauffeur. Slade Farrow works with the Shadow to rehabilitate criminals. I think I got that name wrong earlier. I think I probably confused him with Cliff Marsland, but you can see why. Miles Crofton sometimes pilots the Shadow's autogyro. What it doesn't say, Miles Crofton is also the only person that knew the Shadow was Kent Allard. So he knew him going back to World War I. So he's probably the Shadow's closest agent. Claude Fellows is the only agent of the Shadow ever to be killed. Rutledge Mann is a stockbroker who collects information. He took over from Claude Fellows. Hawkeye is an underworld snoop who tails gangsters and other criminals. So those are the big ones. There's Myra. I forgot, she's an Asian lady. As far as enemies, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
That's okay. Yeah. So the supporting cast in this, like especially with the agents, is an ensemble that I think, and I brought this up to Joe off air, would you say that this may work better as like an HBO miniseries or an AMC series or something like that? Because it's almost too much to fit into one film.
Yeah. You think like if they did like I've said the same thing about Dick Tracy too. Like,
absolutely. Yeah. Even Batman to a degree.
Yeah. I think what they need and what they try and do, and if they had an ongoing comic book series, they could maybe succeed in doing, is just fill out that rogues gallery, because that's one of the flaws with
because
the Shadow.
They all die.
Yeah, they all die. The Shadow kills them, and that's it. Very few, other than maybe Shiwan Khan, the Voodoo Master, the Prince of Evil. That's really, there's the Wasp, there's Hydra, which is, it's pretty much a gang. You kill one, two come up.
Have you ever heard of Hydra from Marvel Comics?
Yeah.
It's Hydra.
Yeah. Before Hydra from Marvel Comics.
Right.
So that's the problem when you have, it's kind of like the Punisher too, except that, he has, the Shadow has Shiwan Khan, the Punisher has Jigsaw. And there's not much more than that because they killed them all, which is cool.
I think to do it, you should have recurring villains, but I do like the concept of having almost like a villain of the week type thing. If we're going to do a show like this,
look at 40s Dick Tracy, he did he killed
like
his...
Flat Top died, right? And then
all
Flat
of them
Top's
died.
son,
All of them died. So he was just strong, creating like good rogues, villains. So the Shadow kind of needs that too. He does have great villains. However, I think he does tend to rely too much on ninjas and just, carbon copy gangsters a lot. But I think for that flaw, it more than makes up with the cool agents. I think it's really cool to have all these agents. They all have distinct personalities and different, talents and skills.
Yeah, they're all they're all characters that are unique that could be fleshed out very well. In my mind, if they did something like Boardwalk Empire, where he's taking down, maybe like bootleggers, and there's one, like, think of Boardwalk Empire's villains and have a season with one villain maybe, and that he gets taken down at the end. And I think that would work very, very, very well as a period piece.
So we can get into the radio show right now. Street and Smith entered into a broadcasting agreement with Blue Coal in 1937. That's one of my favorite things about the radio show. Just listening to the Blue Coal.
Those vintage ads,
I
man.
love it. Gibson teamed up with scriptwriter Edward Hale Bierstadt to develop the new series. The Shadow returned to network airwaves on September 26, 1937 over the new Mutual Broadcasting System. That began with the official radio drama with 22-year-old Orson Welles as Lamont Cranston. This is 1 year before he would go on to direct Citizen Kane, the greatest movie of all time. I think pretty much undebatably, or mostly undebatably by, most cinema institutes. As an interesting side note, that most Shadow fans will know that he did not read the scripts ahead of event, did not have time. He was so busy as a 22-year-old prodigy that he realized there was no law in the books that you had to be sick to ride in an ambulance. So he had his own private ambulance drive around with the sirens on to drive him from radio station to radio station as he did all his things.
People, I think... not men, but people, just our ancestors from only like 100 years ago, the lifestyle they lived and the stuff they did, they were like heroes almost,
They don't make them in that mold anymore. Like, we don't have a Charlie Chaplin or an Orson Welles or even a Cary Grant like type anymore. Like, there's nothing that comes that close. Like, I was even trying to think, like, okay, like, even Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein. Like, we got, like, Jason or Michael Myers, but who would be the Abbott and Costello? Like, there's, I guess maybe 20 years ago, maybe you'd have Cheech and Chong versus Jason or something, but there's not even, like, that iconic of a comedic Borat.
Yeah.
I mean... I don't know. Like, there's not like a comedy duo or a comedy team.
Well, Keenan and Peele, that's it, right? You don't like them?
Key and Peele?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. That's not.
I mean, they're a good deal, but like now you have like Franco and like I guess maybe he's the closest one. Yeah,
but still. Like, you're going like Laurel and Hart. I mean, Abbott and Costello's a low bar, like, to reach even.
Well, in 100 years, they might be talking about, like, back then there's this movie, The Room, and then The Disaster Artist came out. Like, that might be the closest, but the story of Orson Welles doing all this stuff at 22, I think surpasses all of that. Yeah. By the way, if you didn't know his age, he sounds like a distinguished 40-something.
Like, I'd say... If you've never listened, the Blue Coal, if you're going to give it a shot, listen to the Orson Welles Shadow. Like, a lot of them are cheesy, like, going forward. I mean, there's just, I no offense to Bill Johnstone or any of the rest of the Shadows, but there's no comparing to Orson Welles' Shadow. He's just amazing.
And to a degree, some of those are cheesy too. You can almost hear, like, they're, like, trying to stifle laughter sometimes because he's reading
live,
it. It's live. He's reading it for the first time. They do an amazing job at off-the-cuff performances. A lot of those radio dramas, like I was saying, are available as podcast form. And, I guess that's what we're going to get
it's
into.
not like authentic Shadow, really. I mean, there's a couple scenes in it. It's mainly Margot and Lamont. It's kind of more like the Thin Man, like Dashiell Hammett's the Thin Man, like the drunk, Nick and Nora, and their dog Asta. It's more like that. And later on, like, Thrilling Adventure Hour does a great, Beyond Belief with it parodies that kind of Lamont and Margot or Nick and Nora type relationship. So I like that the radio drama seems to be coming back, even the radio comedy in podcast form. If you've never listened to it, I would definitely, there's Batman ones too that are not, I think most people, if you were going to say name one old time radio show, they would say The Shadow.
The Shadow.
You said Little Orphan Annie.
Absolutely.
But I've never listened to a Little Orphan Annie. I've listened to Green Hornet. I've listened to Lone Ranger, Shadow, Whistler, Fibber, McGee and Molly, even Charlie McCarthy, but never Orphan Annie.
There's a lot of good. These are more recent. There's like some Twilight Zone ones. I kind of want to tell an anecdote real quick. So my first experience with The Shadow was my grandfather recounting radio stories he heard, but he told them to me as if he was making these up. So before I knew anything, I thought my grandfather made up this character. And I think the radio dramas had an impact on people, growing up during that era and the Depression that stuck with them, that my grandfather was able to recount this,
It's called
60
Theater
years
of
later.
the Mind.
Absolutely.
Yeah. They're cool. Like even nostalgia piece. It's just the blue coal advertising and everything else. It's just, it's a little hokey because it's like, I am pointing this gun at you now.
Like, you want what?
I will shoot you. I shot you in the stomach right now. You're dying. You're laying down on the ground and dying now. So it's a little hokey, but hey, I think they're great little pieces, little clips of another era.
Look at it as, something that you're looking at from a historical standpoint and enjoy it for that.
For what they do now, like the homages, like there's these, even Welcome to Night Vale and all that. They either do those types of asides in a comedic form, or have more of appreciation for the audience's intelligence to not have to point out these obvious things. I think there could be, and very well is now, a resurgence in the radio drama, and I am very much appreciative for it.
People are driving, all the time to and from work. You need some entertainment.
I love it. I mean, I listen to podcasts more often than music.
Absolutely. Instead of turning on the radio and hearing the same, top 40 over and over again, check out some of this stuff. I think you'll get a lot more out of life for doing so.
But first, here's a safety hint for every motorist. Shake those skid jitters. Have your car equipped with the new Goodrich Safety Silvertown tire. This remarkable tire brings you something entirely new in tire safety. The Lifesaver Tread that automatically sweeps wet roads dry. So dry that you can light a match on the track it leaves. Isn't that convincing proof that these new Goodrich Silvertowns will give you the quickest non-skid stops you've ever had? For safety tomorrow, get Silvertowns today.
So, comic books is something that we talk about on the show.
Yeah, so the worst of the worst is right in the beginning, I think. Well, first there was a comic strip, which I have little knowledge of. I think they did collect, like the comic strip. I've read a very few of them. I don't think there's much in the way of like accuracy of the Shadow from what I recall, but I could be mistaken. Don't get on my ass, Mystery Men. But the Archie series, I do own one issue. It features a blonde man in I believe he's wearing a domino mask. I mean, you can just see from She Want Connie, looks more like Lex Luthor. I mean, these, I think it's like 12 issues of the Archie series, but they're just garbage. Don't waste your time.
So this book you have here, this is a 12 center, Joe. Is this from
1960s,
yeah.
64 to 65.
I see an old price tag of $4.50. What do these go for? About that still, maybe?
I don't know. Depending on the condition, you can probably get maybe, 100 or so for a mint or two,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Right off the bat, I'll say I don't like this because the Shadow's cloak is green.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not accurate at all. He's blonde in it. I mean, I don't know where they fucked that up. The next time he kind of appears in the comics is in the 70s with DC. They did 2 crossovers with Batman, which, go for a pretty hefty price now. In Batman 253 and Batman number 259, the Shadow crosses over Batman. There's in 253, I believe there's like some little mystery, like it centers around that, which I believe is written by Walter Gibson. Actually, let me. I could be mistaken.
Do you mind if I open this?
Yeah, go ahead.
253.
That one, I believe. The other one is.
Oh, okay. This is 259.
259 features an origin story or something. I know Walter Gibson wrote something in them.
253 and 252. I didn't know 253 was this. 252, if I'm not mistaken, is first Roz. So these are two hard to find issues.
They're not hard to find, but they are pricey. Like I lucked out at a con and I got them for a decent price. I think I may have paid $12 for one. I think the other one was in a maybe mislabeled in a 50-cent or dollar bin because it goes.
You gotta love that, man.
One goes for a lot more than that.
This is at this
condition too.
This copy here is in very good condition. The pages are in good shape.
The writer on that one. Who wrote that?
Yeah. So the writer on this is told by Denny O'Neil.
Yeah, like that they kept that with the pulps, like told by.
Yes.
Yeah.
Right. I'm just reading it verbatim.
Walter Gibson did the backstory on this one. Like there's a Prince story. And I know it was the last story he wrote was a Batman story, and before he passed away. But no, you know what? That's in a different comic book. Actually, I'm mistaken. That was like it was the Gray Seal or something. No, not the Gray. Something. Anyway, so in order to publicize or the ongoing Shadow stories, they did some crossovers with Batman. The Shadow, as drawn by Mike Kaluta. Michael Uslan did a couple of issues, including number 11, which is the first Mystery Man crossover with the Avenger. Are you familiar with the Avenger?
Not extensively, beyond the fact that I know that it's a pulp hero.
So he can mush he's very pale, but he can mush his face up, so he's kind of like Clayface.
Okay.
But doesn't go crazy with the size limitations, or doesn't turn his hands into axes or anything like that, but he can disguise himself just by mushing his face around. It's really cool. I like him better even than Doc Savage, but runner up to the Shadow.
Kind of reminds me of the Chameleon a little bit.
Yeah.
Something close.
Yeah. But, so this was written by Uslan. Yeah, Daniel O'Neil. Mike Kaluta's great artwork. If you can pick up any of these 12 issues, strongly recommend them. They're all standalone issues. They're all great. Great artwork. Just great classic 70s comics. A lot of people, Shadow fans and comic collectors, really revere these 12 issues. Unfortunately, it was canceled before it really got,
something that
Michael
DC does today still.
Michael Uslan in our interview talked about it. But they canceled it before they even gave it a chance. Then they realized that they were selling more copies than they expected. And they needed to rush them to print. So after that, we got, a little, I can't remember which one came next. We had Howard Chaykin did Blood and Judgment, and this is one of those comics that either people love it or hate it.
I personally do not like Howard Chaykin's art whatsoever.
I hate his writing. I hate his art.
His faces are all just freaking box squares, man.
He's very much in the vein of 80s Frank Miller, but just worse.
Sure. Yeah, that's a good assessment almost. Yeah.
And he brings the Shadow, and
look at that fat face right there. He's so bad.
He does play on the Lamont Cranston Kent Allard relationship, and does play up the real Lamont Cranston as a bad guy. There are certain things about the plot I like, but what happens, and even going on to Snyder's Batman Shadow that was released, late or early last year, they keep bringing back these characters as though they're 110 years old and still alive, and no one's died of old age or natural causes or anything. The Shadow remains, at peak prime because of something with the Tolkien. I don't even know. That was not part of the original mythology. It was ridiculous back in the 80s. It's even more ridiculous when Snyder does it last year. I'm not a fan of the Chaykin. Hey, if you like it, that's great on you. It revolved off into another series that actually lasted longer than the Great Kaluta series, and just look at...
What is this? I am not familiar with this at all.
So I specifically picked out this issue because that is the last issue of the series, in which in the issue before it, that the Shadow is beheaded, and his head is put on a robot body.
So, guys, if you could picture like the worst things about the '90s in comics.
Yeah,
I'm looking at that right now.
Magnum or whatever.
Magnus, robot fight. Shadow is written in the style of the like Superman
Riveted,
steel,
yeah.
with rivets. This is
the most
ridiculous.
Yeah,
this is like we're trying to like
so it's spun off of Howard Chaykin. It is horrible.
Instead of being reverent. Like, I'm not even, I guess I'll open it, but you could tell that instead of being reverent, they're trying to stylize it as something that it should not be.
It's the god-awful artwork. It's the god-awful plot points. He's got his two Asian sons throughout the entire series, that just bicker back and forth. Once again, the Shadow's kind of like a tertiary character. He's an asshole. He's beheaded and he's given a robot body.
And his head can speak, it looks like.
Yeah.
And it's like instead of the Shadow, like the way they do. I'm a really big fan of lettering and the way they do word bubbles. That takes you in. So when he speaks in some comics, like his word balloons are bright, they're black, like almost like Morpheus and Sandman. This is just terrible. This is.
Yeah, it's horrible, but I'm a Shadow completist. Like I have a whole Tupperware. I can't fit all my Shadow pulps on a bookshelf anymore, but I have like a lot. It's hard to keep up with all the pulps. There's a lot, obviously.
You know what I would compare this to almost? That probably also pisses you off? Turning Jason into a robot as well.
Yeah. I mean, at least that one had like they took it for what it was meant to be cheeky, but this is. It's garbage, but once again, so the Shadow strikes. This is the 80s. This was DC trying to rein it back to the original Kaluta Shadow. There are moments of it's not horrible. It's got decent parts. I think my favorite issue out of the whole thing is the annual. It's got the Kaluta.
Gerard Jones, the writer?
Kaluta back into it. This might be the one that has the Walter Gibson story in the back. They're not hard to find. They're not cheap. But you can see, like, what I don't like is when the transition from the color halftone to the full body color. They didn't have the same color palette, and there was a transitory period where just comic books just didn't look as cool, and I think that's what the Shadow Strike suffers from. But it's still decent. Like if you can pick them up in a dollar bin or something like that, I would recommend them. Like it's nothing to write home about. It gives you a decent glimpse in the character. It does play up on the radio show being accurate. It does play on a lot of the mythology. It has somewhat decent artwork. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Kaluta comes in a couple times, or maybe just does covers. That probably sounds more accurate.
You could tell that this is done with respect to the material.
Yeah.
Definitely.
It goes back to the period piece. It's not done current day like Howard Chaykin's.
They have like the ensemble cast, like the head forms, like on the opening page with their names. I really like that form of storytelling in comics that's not done so much anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, cool. I wish I had. Maybe I'll check out this. So this is an annual. How long did this series go for?
I'm thinking 24, 25 issues. It went on longer than the original. It's unfortunate the best series didn't last as long.
What's really like the little nuances on the bottom left, it has like ha 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 ha. Like you could tell that this was done with love.
Yeah.
The
whole series is definitely done. It's once again, if I'm gonna pick one, I'm gonna pick the 70s Kaluta Shadow. I think anyone in their right mind would. I'm gonna get to a couple other ones that I think are even better, maybe.
Real quick, I was talking about lettering, like the way his word balloons drip, like that's I think is really cool.
Yeah.
In this one that you just told me from the from '89, it looks like.
Yeah. So briefly before that, the Shadow, and I'm not certain the reason why, but perhaps DC lost the license for a short time to the Shadow character, and he went over
to Dark Horse, right?
No, he went over to Marvel.
Oh, what?
Yeah, so Marvel, they had one one graphic novel, the Devil's Astrologer.
I've seen this.
Or the Shadow's Astrologer, where the Shadow fighting Nazis. This is another one that I would strongly recommend picking up. This is a first edition copy of it. It is
by Denny O'Neil
and Mike Kaluta back on artwork. This is the book that, like, it's kind of like the addendum. Like, this is the one that showcases, like, that the DC run should have been longer, and this is them really trying to bring it back.
This cover by Kaluta is great. Right. It's phenomenal. And you could see they can't put the swastika right on the cover, but you see behind him, it's there. You see that? Yeah, that's...
And it's unfortunate because you really think the Shadow fought ninjas and mobsters so often, but in the pulps, it really would have been nice if he fought Nazis more, because Dick Tracy always fought Nazis. Unfortunately, the Shadow did not.
It's like an Indiana Jones, Dick Tracy type thing. Yeah. Period is where Shadow belongs, because he has to live in that world without, I think, the internet and cell phones. I think if you bring that into it, like, maybe it can be done, but
it's never
probably
worked
not
so
well.
far. Like, they've tried it so many times. Dynamite, more recently with Shadow Now. The artwork was fantastic. It had that painted look, great, but the storyline was just blah, you know? Shadow works in the 30s.
Another important thing is like the lexicon at the time. So when like they say like things like
jabroni
or like boyo,
yeah,
like that's very important to this. This looks very good. I'm gonna ask if I can borrow this.
Yeah,
if I
distributed very well because, like I said, it's first print. So, and this might cause some controversy with some viewers. I think the closest
viewers. How are you seeing us right now?
I know. Well, I don't know. I got hidden cameras. I love coming along with the '94 Shadow movie. Fortunately, they came across. Dark Horse picked up the Shadow and came up with some great, mini series. They did a graphic novelization of the movie, which was, the movie sucked. Obviously, the comic book adaptation is going to suck too.
As most of films, I think, do. Like you did the Batman ones.
They just did mini series. They brought back Kaluta. They brought a really darker Shadow. I mean, just flip through. So this is one of my favorites from this, and you can tell it's very well worn, well read. But there's 3 stories in this 122-page issue. It's full of blood and guts. I mean, at one point, the Shadow booby traps this guy, and his brains spill out all over the stairs because he knocks his head down. I mean, great artwork. It really showcases Kaluta. Like, it's a passion project. They did a lot. I can't recall all the names of the miniseries, but I would strongly recommend, other than the graphic novelization of the movie, picking up anything that Dark Horse put out in the 90s relevant to the Shadow. Well, even the Mask. I mean, they did some great stuff in the 90s, Dark Horse.
And the 80s. I mean, absolutely. Sin City, obviously. Dark Horse Presents is another one.
Shadow relevant. I mean, this is some of my favorite stuff.
Was that Rocketeer, Dark Horse as well?
Yeah, I'm fairly certain. Yeah.
The Mask. Yeah, Dark Horse is a great company. Yeah. This looks very good too. It's very visceral. Like axes to the skull and stuff like that, knives to the neck.
And it's very true and very, once again, anything that brings Kaluta seems like he's had just as much of an impact as some of the great pulp painters or illustrators going back to the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, like Norman Rockwell-esque sometimes, especially the covers. But
so then lately, Dynamite has been kind of hit or miss with what they've put out. I'm happy to have anything relevant to the Shadow really come out there. I mean, the way I look at it, as bad as like the Shadow movie was in the 90s, it still introduced me to the character. So if it even introduces, a handful of people to this character, I'd say it's all worthwhile. The Dynamite, I think they started again with the ongoing series relatively recently. However, Pastime Gamer Mats, they have been lackadaisical on my subscription list and have not added that to my box. So I need to talk to them about it, including, we have Batman Shadow, but I don't have Shadow Batman. I didn't even realize that was a thing. So I talked to Alan, the owner over there. I think where they've excelled And Dynamite it's an imprint of Dark Horse, and I think they have budgetary restraints. So they'll get Alex Ross to do covers, or some great painters and illustrators. And then, Francisco Francavilla, or someone like, I guess Francisco Francavilla he's like more of a newcomer. So I don't want to, shit on his work.
Does he do the interiors?
Yeah, he does the interiors for like year one.
Right.
It's for a lot of stuff. But I would call him more of like a less refined Matt Wagner or Darwin Cook type artwork.
It's someone who clearly has like talent and knows how to illustrate. Just needs to be refined, maybe.
Right.
I enjoyed it, but I see exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, and I don't mean it like it's as good as I guess what they can afford. Probably they still got Matt Wagner to write some stuff. They still got Michael Uslan to write some stuff. So I guess they try and spend their money where they can as best they can. Michael Uslan has done Justice Incorporated. He's done the Green Hornet Shadow crossover. They've had a lot of pulp characters. They've had the Avenger. They've had a lot of standalone issues. My personal favorite, and this is another one I lent you, is the Shadow Year One. And in my money, it's a 10-issue series that really does what like Frank Miller did for Batman in Year One, and gives the same respect to the Shadow. I love it. There's so many homages. There's so many panels that Francisco Francavilla does that harken back to the '94 movie. There's a scene on the bridge that like is obviously looked like he's drawing screenshots from the movie and doing it in a smart way, not a cheap way. There's just references that maybe the casual reader won't catch, but the ardent Shadow fan will definitely catch, and it will not mislead or get in the way of the storyline. I've heard some people have had a problem with the way Margot Lane's portrayed, but it's not far off of how she's portrayed in the pulps.
She's portrayed as someone who is sort of, I guess we could get into the story a little bit. Well, gold digger, right. So she's sort of like a, entrapped by the mobster, Joe.
He's an actual mobster from New York. Joe Maserati.
Okay. Yeah.
Maserati. He was the precursor to Lucky Luciano.
Okay.
He was even portrayed in
in Boardwalk. Right. I didn't put those two things together, actually.
Yeah. Except that they didn't have him killed in the way that he was actually killed in real life, which I thought was a disappointment. Instead, he falls off of the Empire State Building, which is under construction. But I do like when they take David Fincher's Zodiac, when they use that as a set piece to show how time has elapsed. Like in that movie, there's a building that's being built, and it's finished by the beginning of the third act of Zodiac.
I need to see that film again.
Oh, I love it.
I saw it in the theater, but I did a double feature of that and Black Snake Moan, and by the time Zodiac, fortunately, was the second film I saw, so I ended Black Snake Moan sucks.
Zodiac is one of my favorites of the last decade.
Absolutely. One of the first Robert Downey Jr.'s gets back. Getting back to the Shadow.
What I'm saying is when they add that, they add little things like that to show the time period you're in, that are just little like the construction site of the Empire State Building later on, 7 issues in, it's it's 77 stories, and that becomes like a battleground. I'm sorry, you were going to say something?
No, I guess we can go back to that. Yeah, historical accuracy in stuff like this, I think, is paramount. It's something that Zodiac did well, Boardwalk Empire did well, The Nick did very well. So having that in something like if they were to do something like that with the Shadow, that's how you have to do it.
But it really portrayed it's told through the eyes of Margot Lane, who is once again, she's the socialite. There's even the allusion to how she's introduced on the pulps, where they've met on a cruise ship before. That's how they met the real Lamont Cranston in the pulps. She mentions that, aren't you taller now? Et cetera, et cetera. She's just portrayed more as promiscuous, I guess.
Absolutely.
But it's alluded to in the pulps. She's socialite.
Well, I think one of the biggest things that people might, I guess, have a problem with. I don't know the community that well, but you're reading it, and she's living this lifestyle that she loves, but
or it just feels like she's used to a lifestyle, and this is the only way she can get it.
Correct. She's about to be killed by Joe Maserati. Maserati, and she goes, "Joe, I'm pregnant." Before he's like about to throw her off a building.
That's the reason why he's about to kill her, because he ditches her because she's too high maintenance, and then that's her way to try and rein him back in, saying that she's pregnant, thinking that she's pregnant.
But she was lying.
Right. And then his reaction is to drop her off the building. Shadow comes and saves her and to hypnotize her so she doesn't remember it, but then she ends up remembering it. So, and this entire time you have this intrepid reporter who ardent fans, like from issue 1, I'm like, that's Maxwell Grant. And that was always my idea for a Shadow movie, was like to do that, like, cause Max, like I said before, like that's how he started every pulp. And he's really like another agent of the Shadow that's just never written about in the pulps. So if you did a movie from his vantage point or from him as a character, I just think that Matt Wagner did an excellent job, did it better than I could have ever written it. And I really, if they were going to adapt any story, I would say this one, but just make, instead of Zorn, just make it Shiwan Khan.
Yeah.
I think the only reason he did is because Shiwan Khan, they always do Shiwan Khan. And I'm glad he didn't do it, but still, if they're going to make a movie, make it Shiwan Khan.
Zorn is a very gruesome villain to do. When he's revealed, that's sort of when the book captivated me. It's a splash page at the end of, I think, issue maybe like 5 or 4.
Yeah.
And
he's got like a dental plant, like leather dental plants, like holding his mouth open.
Absolutely. He's just a straight up maniac.
Nazi, yes.
He hires a prostitute.
Yeah.
And she at first is like very, comforting as one would be if you're paying the money. And then I think in the next issue, one of his henchmen comes and he's like eating gore, and you see like human bones and ribs, and it's not like shown him explicitly like that it's the hooker, but it's the hooker. Like it's that. Yes, it's that definitely is. Like
But anyway, I don't know if I just read it as like raw meat in that aspect.
There was human ribs in that. Yeah.
But there's Zorn, like, who's like feeds off of like people, or feeds off of like grand like chaos, like just the memories of like just chaos or whatever.
He gets similar abilities as the Shadow.
Yeah.
He's almost like, like I guess like not a doppelganger, but like
well, he's like the answer to Ra's al Ghul or something like that, like someone that trained at the same place that Batman did or something. But yeah, he definitely, like, he's definitely a very pulp character. I'm very glad that, like, it just shows that you could create a rogues gallery for the Shadow if you wanted. He's not from the pulps or anything. He's a cool character. I don't buy that maybe like that the German, like they would go to the Orient and train under the same Toku. Like that seems like he's maybe could have been 2 different characters there or something. But, I like it. I love Matt Wagner. I've loved him since his work on Grendel and just everything. Like I even, some of his sparing work on Batman. What else has he done?
Grendel.
That's saying Grendel.
Yeah.
I would call it Grendel, but
Grendel. Is probably his biggest thing. He did also oh god, it's like just a hero. No, Madman was different. I forget the name of it. It's like just a hero like who carries like a baseball bat and a t-shirt.
Oh, that guy. Yeah. What's his name? Yeah.
You know who I'm talking about. Yeah. Early 90s, maybe even late 80s.
Yeah. But Matt Wagner is a big fan of the Shadow, and it shows in this 10-issue arc. It is not like wasted time, I don't think. It's a fast, enjoyable read, in my opinion. Like, for my money, this is a 5-star book. I love it. Like, if I was going to recommend one just introductory Shadow book, I would say pick up this arc. Like, I'm sure it's in graphic novelization or a trade paperback form by now, but
as someone who is not like, like I said, I have like passing knowledge of the Shadow before this, but never really delved deep into it. This was Joe's first recommendation for me, basically. And getting into it maybe was a little bit tough at first. Not tough, but just like, I'm like, what is, like, this is kind of silly because they're speaking in that, that like language of that era. And then once you get through the first like issue or two, you're like, oh, okay, I get this. Like this is
very
fantastic.
dark and very
very dark, very violent.
Yeah.
Which I enjoyed.
I mean, just the way they portrayed his powers. I guess that like there's a couple things like I would have liked to see more of the Agents of the Shadow. Like you meet Joe Cardona, you meet Commissioner Weston, Margot has a big, but there's no Harry Vincent, there's no Mo Shrevnitz, and I know it's a year one story, so it's definitely forgivable for that. But I would think that this would be the skeletal structure for a great Shadow movie. And if they added some of those elements, I think it would be like the Batman Begins. This would set off a great franchise.
I think I agree with you, and certainly by the end of it, I was kind of floored with it. And the art, like we said, not the best, but conveys what they're trying to convey very well. And Matt Wagner's just off the chain with what he does.
I've also seen other work from Francisco Francavilla that's been much worse. And it definitely seems like working with Matt Wagner, he pulled out all the stops. Like he had an appreciation for this story. He had an appreciation and understood like how much better this story was compared to other things he'd worked on, that like this is some of his finest work. I think he still has a lot more room to improve. And that's not saying, like, I've seen plenty of worse artists that have been in the business for a lot longer. And I'm not dissing him at all. Like, I think it's still pretty good especially for Dynamite. I would have liked to see this story maybe if Dark Horse had given Matt Wagner a chance in the 90s, with some of, maybe Kaluta doing it, or even if Matt Wagner did, The Death of Margot and he drew it himself. Like, I would, if they gave him more time to just draw it himself, because Matt Wagner does great artwork. Francisco Francavilla, it's almost like he's definitely modeling his art style after Matt Wagner's, and I think that's a big part of why he's trying so hard in this book.
Yeah, that's something Dynamite, I was going to say, like, they spend a lot of money on their covers, because they do, like, 8 different covers sometimes for certain books.
Rather than do that, I think it'd be better to,
Like, yeah, that's something they know that people who are completists, especially these niche characters are, the fans are completists, so they think they're going to make their money through variant covers. That's what led to the downfall of comics in the 90s. Instead, invest maybe more in the interiors and the writing.
This book is also a couple years old, and I think they've learned their lesson to a certain degree from that. Like, that's what led to their downfall, a lot of these, and they've learned from that, I feel. They've spent a little bit more time with the writing. Matt Wagner, this was kind of like the crossing point. Because before that, if you read Masks is one of the most god-awful pieces of crap I've ever picked up. And unfortunately, I was completist and I picked up every issue and I hated everything. The artwork is so atrocious. It's like copy and paste. It's that stuff like they just take a photo of a background, posterize it so it looks kind of like artwork, and it's just so lazy, so bad. Like there's no continuity between the frames. There's no continuity between the characterization of like how a character is drawn. The storyline is so like ineffectual and nothing. It's just such garbage, and they have gotten better. And I really think that there's a future if they stay with these characters. They've obviously sold, some stuff, and they've gotten a lot better. Like I say, I'm looking forward to picking up Shadow Batman, seeing what that holds.
I would, as someone who's a very hardcore Shadow fan as yourself, like giving it a 5 out of 5 just because it's like everything you wanted. As just a regular comic fan and as a story, 4 out of 5, which is fantastic. But I can see how someone who's been waiting a long time for a very good Shadow story would rate it that highly.
I honestly, I probably should realistically give it room just for a little bit better artwork. But I really think it really, especially the fact that like years ago, I would say like this would be the storyline that I had in my head roughly with the Maxwell Grant, and like picking it up, I was like, damn it, he beat me to it. But I have to give it appreciation for that. Like, and there are things, I mean, I guess if I wanted to be unbiased, I'd probably give it a 4.5 out of 5. I love it. I love this book though. Like, I think it's absolutely great. I think it does the character justice. He's very passionate about it.
Yeah, and as Joe was saying earlier, if you have very little experience with the Shadow and just kind of know who he is as a character in history, very good starting point.
Yeah. And join us next episode. I hope you're enjoying our tribute to the Shadow, because I love the character, and I feel like even if you're not, in the know on the character, like if you're listening to this show and you like Batman, and I think, you can get something out of this, but, I think we'll continue on with our tribute.
We're going to do the Batman Shadow crossover, by Snyder from Dynamite.
We got our Uslan, interview.
Oh, that little thing.
Yeah. He talked to us for a while. That was great. I had a great time. And, we can do our fan casting.
Do a little bit of fan casting, too, which is always a good time.
Okay. So, and remember, kiddies, you can follow us on Facebook at Bruce Wayne's World and
Twitter at Bruce Wayne World.
Or you can email us at
batinfo at brucewaynesworld.net.
Batinfo. I always get that confused. It's a long email. Just message me on Facebook if you want. I can do that too. That's easier.
Or just at Bruce Wayne World and tweet me.
Yeah. That weed of crime over there, that bears bitter fruit. So,
what?
Yeah. And as you sow evil, so shall you reap evil, kiddies. And I'm going to be there in every room, as inevitable as your guilty conscience. I need like a glass. That's how they used to do it, like an empty glass underneath my mouth, and I can do that reverb.
Who else knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men is the Batman Universe Podcast Network. I would go there too.
Bruce Wayne's World knows. Your laugh would not be very intimidating.
I can do the shadow one. I just wasn't doing it there. Like, hey, I can see you.
Is that a child molester over there?
Nice mustache, perv.
Get away from me, you creep. Just some innocent criminals and gangsters over here.
Like, it's not even, it's just like I'm in a park.
Yeah.
I
know what evil lurks in you.
I can see you, evil. Cleanse your evil from you. Pedophilia is no joke.
That's my Red Bull thing.
Anyways, that
doesn't work.
Check out part 2, which will be the next episode, and we will hear you, or you'll hear us then, and we'll see you then.
I'll be watching you.
Ha 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 ha.